Fundamentals of Pedagogy by Lucian Breathsonings 1 of 4. 1. The hospital technician helped the patient recover after surgery. He did this by dripping treacle down the victim's throat. He demonstrated the food was moving into the esophagus using a model. Then he showed the food being swallowed using the throat. Finally, he showed the food entering the stomach. In this way, the hospital technician helped the patient recover after surgery by dripping treacle down the victim's throat. 2. The aircraft manufacturer tested that there was enough room to move around in his seat. He did this by putting his mouth around the spoon. First, he placed the vegan yogurt on the spoon. Then, he put the center of the spoon in the middle of his mouth. Finally, he closed his mouth and withdrew the spoon. In this way, the aircraft manufacturer tested that there was enough room to move around in his seat by putting his mouth around the spoon. 3. The river cruise captain planned how to use water. She did this by stopping food sticking to her tongue by putting water on it. First, she placed a pile of small sponges in the middle of her tongue. Then, she removed the top sponge and placed it on the back of her tongue. Finally, she put the second sponge on the front of her tongue. In this way, the river cruise captain planned how to use water by stopping food sticking to her tongue by putting water onto it. 4. The train lift driver lifted his food crate into the train. He did this by poking his tongue out underneath the fork. First, he measured how far his tongue protruded from his mouth. Next, he placed the fork this distance from his lips. Finally, he moved the fork above his tongue and put the food into his mouth while retracting his tongue. In this way, the train lift driver lifted his food crate into the train by poking his tongue out underneath the fork. 5. The network officer ate a degree at the campus shop that was on the network. He did this by eating enough, in other words, a jarful. He started the counter at 0. Then, he added 1 to the count for each new treacle cupcake. Finally, he stopped adding 1 to the number when there were no more cupcakes. In this way, the network officer ate a degree at the campus shop that was on the network by eating enough, in other words, a jarful. 6. The club manager swallowed the lozenge in a particular way to prepare to descend the stairs. He did this by moving the tablet fragment to the back of his mouth with his tongue. First, he placed the lozenge fragment on the front of his tongue. Then, he closed his teeth over the tablet fragment and pushed his tongue forward, sliding the pill piece onto the back of his tongue. Finally, he swallowed the lozenge fragment. In this way, the club manager took the pill in a particular way to prepare to descend the stairs by moving the tablet fragment to the back of his mouth with his tongue. 7. The truck driver practiced his hand-eye coordination. He did this by placing the plum segment into his mouth with his hand. First, he put the plum portion midway between the sides and top and bottom of his lips, so that it was past his top front teeth. Following this, he lowered the plum segment onto his tongue. This way, the truck driver practiced his hand-eye coordination by placing the plum part into his mouth with his hand. 8. The dressmaker prepared to sew a hem on a dress. He did this by eating a marshmallow with a knife and fork. First, he pierced the marshmallow with his fork. Next, he pierced the marshmallow with a knife and cut it in half. Finally, he stabbed the left side of the marshmallow again with his fork and lifted it to his mouth. In this way, the dressmaker prepared to sew a hem on a dress by eating a marshmallow with a knife and fork. 9. The mushroom farmer tested the mushrooms had enough fertilizer and water. She did this by testing that her cordial was sweet by drinking it. First, she prepared to put some of the cordial on top of her tongue. Then, she put some of the cordial on the tip of her tongue, where she could taste its sweetness. So, she put the cordial where it was both on top of her tongue and touched her sweet spot. In this way, The mushroom farmer prepared to test the mushrooms had enough fertilizer and water by testing that her cordial was weak by drinking it. 10. The confectioner prepared to make each section of a lolly snake. He did this by chewing and swallowing each part of the lolly snake. First, he disconnected a segment of the snake and then placed it in his mouth. After this, he lifted his arm up, and then back down on a new path, not near his face. Finally, he repeated the process until he had eaten all of the snake segments.